This is another episode of Standup Comedy, your host and MC, celebrating 40-plus years on the fringe of show business. Stories, interviews, and comedy sets from the famous and not so famous. Here's your host and MC, Scott Edwards.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for another special bonus show, an audience of one, and we have our good friend, Tim Bedore. Now, you'll remember the name. He's got his own podcast, An Agnostics Guide to Heaven, and he was a regular on the Bob and Tom radio show, the host and star of Vague But True. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Tim Bedore.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Scott. Good to hear your voice. Good to be back with you. I've got a special VBT, a Vague But True, for you. Would you like me just to go ahead and jump into it?
Oh, yeah, I'm so excited. Ladies and gentlemen, pay attention.
Here he is, a philosopher, a writer, a comedian, a man who knows the future but prefers to let the fiery ending be a total surprise, the host of Vague But True, Tim Bedore. Well, thank you very much. You haven't asked, but let me ask myself, how do I fill my days? Golf, when I can. Fighting communism and global warming wherever I find it, of course. But these days, I'm also a life coach and a spiritual guru helping people with their problems, like the one in this recent email I got. Hey, Tim, I need some advice, and I know you don't charge, so I'm turning to you. Here's my problem. I'm a rancher, and I had this idea I was going to rope a deer. Since deer congregate at my cattle feeder, I thought it would be easy to rope one, wrestle it down, hog tie it, put it in a stall, feed it corn for a couple of months, then harvest and eat it. After filling up my cattle feeder, 3 deer showed up. I picked out a meaty-looking one, stepped out and lassoed it, then wrapped the rope around my waist so I would have a good hold. The deer stood until I put a little tension on the rope, and that's when I got educated about deer. Deer may stand there looking at you funny while you rope them, but once you start pulling on that rope, Tim, they explode. That deer pulled me around the prairie like I was a rag doll. It was then I realized, pound for pound, a deer is a lot stronger than a cow. A cow in that weight range I could wrestle to the ground and look pretty good doing it. A deer? I was an atheist applying for a job at the Vatican. No chance. I hadn't felt so weak and embarrassed since getting stuffed in a junior high locker after a wedgie attack. As that deer bucked and twisted and jerked me off my feet and dragged me across the county, it occurred to me, having a deer on a rope was not clearly as good an idea as I had originally imagined. It took me a few minutes to realize this since I was mostly blinded by the blood flowing out of the big gash in my head. Even with that gash and several large knots I got from cleverly arresting the deer's momentum by bracing my head against various large rocks it dragged me across, I could still think clearly enough to recognize the wild devil had dragged me in a huge circle back towards the squeeze chute I use on my cattle. If I could only get to my feet and wrap my arms around his neck, I had a chance. Tim, did you know that deer bite? When a deer bites you, it's not like being bit by a horse. A horse will just bite you and let go. A deer is more like a pit bull with spears on its head. Deer bite and then shake their head, and you trying to rip your arm out of their mouth, well, that makes them shake even more. You know what they like to do next? Rear up on their back feet and strike you in the head. Being a rancher, I know when a horse strikes at you, the best thing to do is make a loud noise and aggressively move towards the animal. But nothing I had learned about animals was working with this deer, so I screamed like a baby and turned and ran. Here's the reason why you don't turn and run. The sadistic beast hit me right in the back of the head and knocked me down. Then they stomp on your back and jump up and down while you lay there crying like a little girl. I finally managed to crawl under my truck, and eventually the triumphant deer went away. I needed medical attention and barely got myself to the local farmer's co-op and lied a little bit, claiming I had been attacked for no good reason by a psycho deer. Considering all the blood, deer hair, and hoof prints all over me, it wasn't a hard story to sell. After word got around town, parents didn't let their kids outside for months, and ranchers started carrying sidearms. I kind of feel bad for lying, but it was either that or constantly hearing town folk say, "There is the dumbass that tried to rope a deer." Tim, my question for you is, am I an idiot for thinking I could rope a deer? I have begun to second-guess myself, and that is not something you want to have going on when you're a rancher and out working with animals and heavy equipment. And it's signed, Bruce Baumgartner, Missoula, Montana. Bruce, first you need to stop being so sexist and say you cried like a little girl. You cried like an adult, dumbass male because that male dumbass tried to rope a deer. Now, are you a dumbass who should have doubt over his ability to see the obvious and keep himself safe out there in the Wild West? Well, at least once, yes, you were a total dumbass who nearly killed himself. This we know, but making mistakes is how we learn. Making big mistakes is how we learn a lot or die. I advise you to try to look at what you've done in the past, like running a ranch that hasn't killed you as of yet, and balance that off with your big dumbass moment and see the big picture. And in the future, don't rope a grizzly bear, a moose, a deer, and you should be fine. And that's the kind of advice I give to people in Agnostics Guide to Heaven. If you have any problems, get in touch. So other than that and stand-up comedy, that's the kind of work I do now from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the introverts stare at their shoes and the extroverts stare at your shoes. I'm Tim Bedore with a special edition of Vague But True, Scott Edwards Stand-Up Comedy, your host and MC podcast.
That was great, Tim. Thanks so much. And there's such wisdom in there. I hope all our listeners have learned something from this dramatic storytelling.
Well, you specifically don't try to rope a deer, but, see the big picture. Yes, he made a mistake. He made a huge mistake, but that's how we learn. That's life. So don't get too down on yourself, Bruce.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed another Vague But True bonus show from our good friend and comic, Tim Bedore. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stand-Up Comedy, your host and MC. For information on the show, merchandise, and our sponsors, or to send comments to Scott, visit our website at www.standupyourhostandmc.com. Look for more episodes soon and enjoy the world of stand-up comedy. Visit a comedy showroom near you.